Of all the movies that didn't need a sequel, Gladiator is near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. But in his old age, Ridley Scott can't seem to leave well enough alone. Gladiator 2 isn't nearly as bad as the Napoleon hit piece turd he dropped last Thanksgiving, but if you asked me, are you not entertained? I'd have to say, yeah, I'm not really entertained. In a lot of ways, this Gladiator sequel tried to walk in the same footsteps as the lauded original, but it missed almost all of the emotional, weighty story beats that made its predecessor so timeless. And when it did try to summon the spirit of the original, the cheap, obvious nostalgia bait elicited more eye-rolling than it did warm and fuzzy feelings. The action sequences are bloody and satisfying, and there's a few small areas where the movie shines. But on the whole, Gladiator 2 will echo in eternity as an unnecessary sequel devoid of compelling storytelling. I'll get more into why Gladiator 2 was nothing more than hollow bread and circuses compared to the original after we recap the events of the film. So go ahead and salute the spoilers as they enter the arena. After we get through an intro sequence where it looks like they just ran scenes from the original through an AI art filter, the text that fades on and off the screen informs us that Marcus Aurelius' vision of a Rome returned to the people and the Senate never came to pass. And Rome now suffers under the rule of two tyrannical emperors, Geta and Caracalla, two seemingly inbred freaks who parade around in whiteface. So right off the bat, before we even see any new scenes, Maximus's efforts in the original were totally in vain. We're off to a great start. We begin in Numidia, where a young soldier called Hanno is rallying the inhabitants of the city against a Roman invasion on the horizon. Under the command of General Acacius, the battle goes how most battles go when people tried to stand against the Roman Empire. Hanno's warrior wife is killed in the battle, and he and the other survivors are taken as captives of Rome. Predictably, Hanno quickly finds a home in the arena, and he's purchased as a gladiator by Macrinus, a wealthy, ambitious arms dealer. Macrinus brings Hanno to compete in the Colosseum in Rome as Hanno vows revenge on the whole of the empire, or at least on General Acacius, whose army killed his wife. Meanwhile, General Acacius has returned to the city with a hero's welcome. He and his wife Lucilla, Marcus Aurelius' daughter and Commodus' sister in the original, are keen to overthrow their tyrant twin emperors as they plot with some of Rome's senators. While in attendance at some of the games, Lucilla recognizes a line of poetry Hanno recited earlier, as well as one of his mannerisms in the arena, and deduces that he could be her missing son Lucius, who she sent away after the events of the first film, as with him now being the rightful heir to the throne, his life would be in danger. She meets with the gladiator, who refuses to recognize her as his mother, telling her that Lucius died long ago when she sent him away. But his demeanor changes when she tells him that Maximus was his father. Then Macrinus pulls some strings and has Lucilla and Acacius taken prisoner, a move that removes the pair from the board and gains Macrinus' favor with the emperors. The captured Acacius is set up to fight Lucius in the arena, giving Lucius his chance to get the revenge he seeks upon the man who killed his wife. Inside the arena, however, Acacius apologizes to Lucius and tries to inform him of his and Lucilla's plans. But what truly stops Lucius's rage is when Acacius drops the "No, Maximus is your father" reveal on him. While Lucius mulls over this revelation, the Praetorians turn Acacius into a porcupine with all the arrows they put into him, and he dies. This backfires for the emperors, however, as the killing of a beloved general prompts the people to riot, throwing the city into chaos, which Macrinus uses to his advantage. After revealing to Lucilla his past as Marcus Aurelius' slave and his long-term plot for revenge, Macrinus convinces the syphilitic emperor Caracalla to kill his brother Geta, and Macrinus holds his hand over the blade while they saw off Geta's head together. In the aftermath, Macrinus is named Caracalla's second consul, behind a literal monkey that is named first consul. To cap off the final culmination of his masterminded plan, Macrinus plans for one final gladiatorial contest, with Lucius set to defend Lucilla and the conspiring senators against dozens of Praetorians. But Lucius has secretly freed all of his fellow gladiators, and they pour into the ring as well. During the ensuing melee, Macrinus kills Caracalla and then kills Lucilla himself before fleeing the city with Lucius in pursuit. Outside the city, two opposing armies have been rallied to the gates of Rome, seemingly to fight each other, but instead they just end up quietly watching Lucius and Macrinus duel. During their fight, Macrinus pins Lucius underwater and proceeds to jackhammer his breastplate with his sword. He thrusts down on Lucius like 10 times, and every strike literally bounces off of it with a ding in what is easily the stupidest, most laughable thing I've seen in months. Then Lucius kills Macrinus and reveals his identity as the Prince of Rome and his intention to unite Rome. And everyone just accepts this, even though seemingly every person who knows Lucius's true identity and could confirm this is dead. And the movie ends in the Colosseum, where Lucius mourns both of his parents who died there. Now, as you can probably tell from how that recap wrapped up, the movie really didn't stick the landing. But the truth of the matter is you're not likely to care by that point anyway. For you see, Gladiator 2's biggest problem is that it tells a story largely devoid of feeling and meaning. It actually suffers from what I'll call the big three, because in addition to an uninspired, emotionless story, it also has a main character problem and a villain problem. But we'll start with the story. We're thrust into the central storyline before we're even made to care about a single character in the movie. Lucius's wife dies before we know her name. We don't even know anything about Lucius, who he is, his true identity at this point, nothing. So without setting anything up, she's dead and the movie expects us to care about this supposedly emotional death. But how can we when you deprived us of feeling any of that emotional pain? You feel nothing for her death, and it doesn't end there, because without caring about her, Lucius's drive for revenge and his story carry zero emotional weight for most of the film. He's just the main character and you need to care about his story because we told you to. His character's entire motivation has to change from avenging his slain wife to protecting his captured mother before you feel anything from his story. And making matters worse, Lucius is borderline jovial in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death, making the whole sequence that sets up the rest of the film feel weird. By contrast, in the original, we spent a fair amount of time with Maximus before his fall and his family's brutal death. We got to know him and who he is and his standing in the Empire first. We saw him become a sputtering, babbling mess after finding his family slain, and he remained sullen and belligerent for some time afterward. And his driving motivation was palpable throughout the entire film. And when comparing these two stories, it's just baffling, because it's like Ridley Scott doesn't even remember the things that made the original so good. Did he learn nothing from his own movie? In so many ways, he tried to produce a bigger, better, grander version of the original, with the story following along much of the same path. But at the same time, this sequel seemingly missed on every single emotional beat it tried. Another example can be found amongst the gladiators that fought with Lucius. There was zero camaraderie with his fellow nameless gladiators, of whom we don't get to know a single one. Contrast that with Maximus's peers and how his relationships with them helped not only carry the movie's middle act, but also brought more out of Maximus as a person, as a character. Lucius doesn't have anything like this outside of a forced friendship he has with an Indian doctor. And it's not for a lack of opportunity. Lucius is surrounded by the same gladiators for the whole movie. Ridley Scott was simply too lazy to bother fleshing any of them out. Without those kind of interactions, Lucius feels even more like a tool that the movie uses just to make things happen, rather than a fleshed out character. Which is ironic, because there's a scene where Lucius tells Macrinus that he'll never be his tool. And they must have cut out the second half of the sentence, where he goes on to say, "Because I'm already Ridley Scott's tool." These examples, and others like them found in Gladiator 2, perfectly display how this sequel tried to copy the original in the basic ways, but utterly failed to emulate the best parts of Gladiator. And with the movie missing on all of those emotional beats, the story just leaves you feeling nothing. Now, it wasn't for a lack of trying, as Gladiator 2 beats you over the head with hollow callbacks to the original as it attempts to force you to feel nostalgic. The film attempts this through using some of the iconic music of the original, and through some of its objects like Maximus's armor, or through some of Lucius's mannerisms that he took from Maximus, like picking up and rubbing the dirt or running up the steps into the arena. But the most egregious attempts at this came through the many memorable quotes from the original that were randomly and meaninglessly peppered throughout the movie, which were usually uttered for no reason at all. They drop the "in this life or the next" line and "he was a soldier of Rome." You hear "strength and honor" quite a bit, and they absolutely abused the classic "what we do in life echoes in eternity." And when they repeat these lines, entirely devoid of meaning in the context they're uttered in, the only thing you feel is your eyes about to roll out of your head, as these moments all feel just like the cheap nostalgia bait they so clearly are. That's not everything, but that's most of what's wrong with Gladiator 2's main story. Moving on to the movie's main character problem, in addition to the already discussed issues with his origin story, I simply didn't find Lucius all that interesting or charismatic, nor his story all that compelling. At least not in the ways a main character in their story should be. And no one I talked to saw it any differently. Although Lucius's story picks up a little bit more steam toward the end, I still can't help but feel like focusing on General Acacius' story would have made for a better film. Sure, it would have been even more of a retread of the original film's story, but it's not like the movie we got did all that much to separate itself from the original anyway. Simply put, Gladiator 2 has a weak protagonist, devoid of depth, and it makes it exceedingly hard to care about the story. I don't know if Paul Mescal was just not up to the task and was miscast, or if Ridley Scott just gave him crap to work with, but the main character is absolutely one of the weakest parts of the film. On the other side of the arena, Gladiator 2 suffers from an equally serious villain problem. A problem that's exacerbated by the fact that the movie actually cycles through 3 different villains, and technically 4 if you count Emperors Dumb and Dumber individually. At the beginning, you assume that General Acacius is going to be the big bad, what with Lucius's rage being pointed directly at him, of course. But when he then proceeds to not do anything antagonistic from that point on, your focus shifts to the twin emperors. And yeah, they're tyrannical inbred little monsters who deserve to take a high dive into a pool shallower than their gene pool, but they're one-dimensional and so stupid that they never feel like a real threat. In the third act, however, the true villain reveals himself in Macrinus. He planned and plotted his way into the Imperial Circle and has now killed the emperors and eyes the throne for himself. But then he goes out in a sword fight with a gladiator?
Oh, you motherfuckers.
You take your big bad, who for the entire movie has used his wealth and influence in the shadows to manipulate his way to the top, and you then put him in martial combat that completely belies his villain archetype? It undercuts this villain's entire story, and it just reeks of a writer lazily phoning it in to wrap up a story that was spiraling out of control. To make matters worse for the sequel, Commodus from the original was one of the most memorable villains of the millennium thus far. He smothered his own father. He ordered Maximus's death. He made sure Maximus's family was burnt to a crisp. He lusted after his own sister. He wounded Maximus before their duel. That is a villain. You never had to shift your focus from one big bad to another, and he was an unstable, powerful, dangerous presence throughout the entire film. But Gladiator 2 doesn't have any villain even come close to Commodus's level, making a story that was already lacking so much feel even more lacking. Funny enough, Denzel Washington's character was the one people were most skeptical about after the first trailer released. That was mostly owing to his accent, which sounded more at home in New York, and his trademark Training Day smiling attitude. But his performance as Macrinus actually turned out to be one of the few bright spots of the movie. And when your movie has very serious flaws with its story, its main character, and its villains, it needs all the bright spots it can get. As is obvious by this point, I have exceedingly little good to say about Gladiator 2, especially having more time to think about what I watched. But there are aspects of it worthy of praise. First and foremost, Gladiator 2 is grand and spectacular. In the strict meaning of the word, that is, in that it's a spectacle. I mean, they actually built a scale replica of the arena to film in, and filled it with thousands of extras. All the action within the arena is sufficiently bloody, brutal, and fun, even if the CGI doesn't hold up at times. Although the movie quite literally and figuratively jumped the shark with some of the events going on in the Colosseum. The sound design was impeccable, and that's evident from the very first action sequence of the movie. And the music was pretty good too, if not a tad distracting at times. Overall, I'd say the movie had a very high production quality, but with a $250 million budget, that should be expected. And all the money and luster in the world can't make up for a crappy story littered with weak characters. I'm not going so far as to give Gladiator 2 a hate watch label, although I get closer and closer the more I think about the movie. So for now, I grant Gladiator 2 mercy and will allow it to escape with a debate watch label. Now in this case, that means I don't think Gladiator 2 is worth your money, and I'd recommend waiting till the movie is out on streaming or TNT or wherever it is mediocre movies go these days. As it stands right now, Gladiator 2 is getting an 84% from viewers on Rotten Tomatoes, but I fully expect that number to drop in the coming days. Meanwhile, it's getting a 5.9 on Metacritic, a rating that's already dropped from the first time I looked at it. Personally, I'm giving Gladiator 2 a 4.5 because it's the holidays and I'm a nice person. Like I said at the top, this might be the most unnecessary sequel of all time. Gladiator is a movie that's been held in extremely high regard for decades, and its story was perfectly self-contained. This sequel was never going to live up to the original, and Ridley Scott knows that. Yet he still tossed this lazy, unimaginative movie up on the big screen. At least he's still in, well, I was going to say rare form, but it's actually pretty common for him, as Scott picked up where he left off with Napoleon, and once again went after people questioning his movie's historical accuracy. When asked if they ever actually had sharks in the Colosseum, Ridley replied by shouting at the reporter, "You're dead wrong. The Colosseum did flood with water and there were sea battles. Dude, if you can build a Colosseum, you can flood it with fucking water. Are you joking? And to get a couple of sharks in a net from the sea. Are you kidding? Of course they can." A lot of people think it's time for Scott to hang him up, but I think him making an ass out of himself and his legacy is good content, so I'm cheering for the crusty, salty old coot. But what he's putting on screen recently hasn't been as entertaining. Gladiator 2 is an unnecessary sequel that doesn't escape its predecessor's shadow in any way, shape, or form. Gladiator 2 is fun in the arena, but flat everywhere else. And with the visual spectacle really the only thing the movie gets right, it's the very definition of hollow, meaningless bread and circuses. Did you watch Gladiator 2? How do you think it stacks up against the original? What unbridled disaster will Ridley Scott grace us with next Thanksgiving? Do you hope that he keeps up this new holiday tradition? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to hit that thumbs up and subscribe to HateWatchers for reviews of other current shows and movies. Thank you for having the strength and honor to turn this movie to shadows and dust with us today, and we'll catch you on the next one.